By the way, the widow of Zarephath and Naaman are Jesus in his first sermon at Nazareth. They are his two examples of faith. And he pits two pagans over against the Pharisees. And you know that made them happy. Okay. These two obscure pagans. You know, I'll show you what real faith is. It ain't you guys. You're supposed to be living in the most optimal way in relationship with the true God to attract people in the nations where they are enslaved and living in chaos, where there is all this wickedness, the bloodshed, the immorality, the terror. You're supposed to be an example of what they should want. This is why Revelation 2, Revelation 3 uses, in one case, a messianic psalm that to him that overcomes, I will put him over the nations. He will rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's a messianic psalm Jesus quotes about you. I want to start sort of with a little story, a little confession again. When I got out of high school, I went to Bible college. So I went to Bible college for 3 years, and I finished my undergrad at a liberal arts Christian university. It, took some Bible classes there. I wound up having a double major in Bible and history. So I had, we'll call it 5 years. And I went to seminary a total of 2 years, 1 year at 2 different places. So now we're up to 7 years before I hit, secular graduate school. I wound up going to graduate school at Penn for Egyptology and ancient history, and then Wisconsin for Hebrew and Semitic languages. But in the 5 years, or 7 years, that I had in evangelical institutions studying Bible, this is not an exaggeration, I had 1 clock hour, not credit hour, like a 1 credit class that lasts for 15 weeks. No, I had 1 clock hour, 60 minutes of instruction on angels and demons in 7 years. Now, at the time, you don't think anything about that. As time went on, what sort of soaks into your head is, well, if this stuff were important, or if there was anything to really think about here, they would spend more time on it. 60 minutes in 7 years. Okay, there's a lot more to think about than 60 minutes in 7 years. And a lot of it is just either omitted intentionally. I don't think that's the case with most things. I think it's just missed because we tend to, even with our professors, we tend to sort of perpetuate this subject the way we were taught it, and then we just sort of mimic, what we're doing to the next generation, our students and whatnot. So this, I would venture to say, unless you've read Unseen Realm and especially the Demons book, it's going to be new. And you can always read those books again to get the details. But typically, if I asked about spiritual warfare, you would think, oh, okay, the serpent, Satan, the fall, maybe Job 1 and 2, because we have, in English Bibles, capital S, Satan in Job 1 and 2. Some will say the adversary, which is actually better. But you might sort of mentally default there. A lot of people will think of Daniel 10. And so for the time that we have today, this is where I'm actually going to start. In Daniel 10, we have, this is a familiar passage, but let me just, right here, scrolls a little bit too fast. We have Daniel in conversation with a supernatural being. And the being says, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. And if you go down, we've got this figure mentioned again, Prince of Persia. I will return to fight against the Prince of Persia. When I go out, behold, the Prince of Greece will come. So a lot of Bible students are familiar with Daniel 10, that we have supernatural princes that are associated with national entities, geopolitical entities. And we know they're supernatural because the one they're fighting against is Michael, who is the prince of Israel. We find that out in Daniel 12. Michael is one of the chief princes. Later, Jewish literature are going to refer to Michael and these other chiefs as archangels and whatnot. So a lot of people are going to think, okay, spiritual warfare, it must be Daniel 10. That must be the place in the Old Testament where this sort of kicks into gear. Of course, Daniel's really late in the biblical storyline. They're in exile. And it creates this impression that there isn't a whole lot happening here until you get to this incident. You know, maybe connecting it back to the visions of Daniel 2 or Daniel 7 with the four empires. Very few people ask what is actually an obvious question, though, if you really think about it. Where does Daniel get this idea? Now, you could default and use the easy answer, oh, well, God just popped that into his head when he was writing the book of Daniel, regardless of the fact that the book of Daniel never says that Daniel wrote it. We'll just put that to the side at this point. But you might think this is new information. It's not the case. Daniel actually has something he's drawing on that makes complete sense with this notion that there are supernatural beings over geopolitical entities, nations. And that's what we want to look at, because the history of this idea is a lot older than Daniel's time period. So I like to jump into this talking about Genesis 1 through 11. Again, we're only going to focus on one of the three rebellions, but you might not even be familiar with the three rebellions. So if I like to sort of break into the question this way, when I get this in Q&A or maybe on an interview or something, it usually goes something like, are demons fallen angels? What about a third of the angels rebelling? I mean, because this is sort of the way that we learn how to talk about cosmic powers of darkness. And so I have to sort of stop and say, okay, we need to get oriented here. We need to have the right orientation. So I use this question. If you were to walk up to the average Christian and ask, why is the world such a mess? Why is humanity depraved? Why do we have evil like we do? The answer that the average Christian will give you is, and this is the answer I would have given, even while I was a doctoral student in grad school, was, that's the fall. It's what happened in the Garden of Eden. The serpent, Satan, the snake, all this stuff. That's why. But if you actually read, and it's a ton of stuff, the literature in between the testaments, when the Old Testament ends, the New Testament begins, there's this whole period intertestamental. Scholars refer to it as the Second Temple period, because that's when the Second Temple's built after the exile, and then we go on into the New Testament period. So it's about 500 years, and there's a lot of stuff written. No Jew would answer that question the way that Christian just did. If you ask the average Second Temple Jew, why is the world so evil? Why are humans so depraved? How did we get into this mess? Nobody's going to say, oh, that's Genesis 3, you dummy, don't you know your Bible? The answer you would get is, well, there's actually three reasons why the world is the chaotic mess that it is. Now, the first of those three reasons is what happens in Genesis 3. Because in that story, we have the first indication that we have a supernatural being. By the way, the serpent in Genesis 3 is not just a snake. Genesis 3 is not a zoology lesson. Oh, snakes used to be able to talk, just like in the first book of the Chronicles of Narnia. No, it's not a zoology lesson. Everyone in the ancient world, you can pick any civilization in the ancient Mediterranean, when animals talked, they didn't think, oh, well, animals used to be able to talk. They thought, no, animals don't talk. The gods must be up to something. they're either inhabiting this thing or they come in the guise of this thing and they're up to something. One of the Egypt's case is the shipwrecked sailor. It's got this big serpent, that is it's not a fall story, but it's a very easy, sort of parallel. What's going on here is if you, again, I go through all the data in both Unseen Realm and the Demons book, and I shouldn't say all the data. I'm actually withholding a lot of information about the way I take Genesis 3. There's a lot in Unseen Realm, there's a lot in the Demons book, but trust me, I could do a whole other book on stuff that isn't in those other two books on this. We have a supernatural rebel. And this passage in Genesis 3 has connections to Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. And I know Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 are not about Satan. I know that. I understand it. It's very obvious. They're diatribes against the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre. But the way these two kings are portrayed draws on the story of a supernatural rebel in the divine council. That's what's lurking in the background. That's how the kings are portrayed. That's how their hubris and their arrogance are portrayed. Isaiah 14, the king says, I will be like the Most High. I will be above the stars of God. All those phrases, I will ascend to the heights. Okay, this is all language for divine counsel, both within the Hebrew Bible and in other Canaanite texts. Okay. We have the story of a divine rebel who is rebelling against heavenly superior authority. And that's what happens in Eden. So we get the first figure on the supernatural side that is opposing God's will. And we also get the first human rebellion. So that's the first installment of, again, 3. So Genesis 3 is important. But we also get 2 more. We get the incident with Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the sons of God and the daughters of men. Okay, which Peter, when he references in 2 Peter 2, angels that sinned, he puts it at the time of the flood, and they are in Tartarus, they are in the abyss, which Genesis 6 doesn't say. But the wider, again, the Greek version of the story of sons of God and daughters of men before the flood, the Titan story does have them there. And more importantly, the Mesopotamian story, that's the backdrop to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, also has them. Again, Unseen Realm, Reversing Hermon, the Demons book has all the details. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is about, and I'll use Peter's terminology or Jude's terminology, the transgression of the boundary between heaven and earth. Okay, it is a divine rebellion. It is a divine transgression that has a dramatic impact on humans. The original Mesopotamian story accounts for every element of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Sons of God, daughters of men, this weird interbreeding sort of thing, whatever that is, going on. And it also accounts for Genesis 6, 5. Have you ever wondered when you read Genesis 6, 4, the weird stuff, sons of God, Nephilim, and all that? Then you get to verse 5, and what does it say? And God saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his own heart was only evil continually. Well, how do we get people end up like that in light of the first 4 verses? If you knew the Mesopotamian story that Genesis 6, 1 through 5 is responding to, you would know the answer to that question. And it's weird because the older Mesopotamian stuff actually is known in between the Testaments by writers of books like 1st Enoch, the Genesis Apocryphon, and a few others. They know this backstory, and they use it to retell Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The answer is that when the sons of God come down, they don't just want to create their own imagers, which is a transgression. They're mimicking God. They want their own people to be their proxies on earth. They're not authorized to do that. So that's one issue. But the other issue is that they teach humans certain things to bring up civilization. The Babylonian version of this is why Babylon was great, because the gods gave us divine knowledge. This is why Babylon is superior to everybody else. And it's why we're just at the top of the heap. To the Israelites, the Jewish authors, it's like, well, what did they teach you? And you actually get a grocery list in both the Mesopotamian stuff and, again, Second Temple Judaism. things like astrology, arts of warfare, fashioning weapons to more efficiently kill each other, drugs, astrology, idolatry is the big one. Arts of seduction to proliferate immorality. All these things are actually listed out in both texts. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is sort of a little capsule form. But this is why the New Testament connects false teaching. Peter and Jude, read it. Who do they compare false teachers to? The angels that sin. Lo and behold, there's a context for that. They're sent back to the abyss, where they're in chains of gloomy darkness, as Peter has. Peter uses the word tartarao. They're sent to Tartarus, which is where the Greek Titans are imprisoned. Again, that's the Greek equivalent of this story. Mesopotamian story, they're sent to the abyss from whence they came to never return. All the elements are there. Everybody in Second Temple Judaism knows this, and they all accept it as a supernatural and human problem. Supernatural rebellion that proliferates and accelerates human depravity and self-destruction. So that's the second problem, second reason we have a chaotic mess. And the third one is Babel, and this is where we're going to park today. Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, and of course this is going to link into Psalm 82. Now, let's go to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, but think about Genesis 11. This is the Tower of Babel story. I'm just going to take that off for the moment. If you read through the Tower of Babel story, guess what? You're not going to see any supernatural beings in there except for God. Okay? So you say, Mike, where do you get this idea? Where did Jews in between the Testaments get this idea that somehow there's a supernatural rebellion problem here along with the other Babel stuff? Because I'm reading Genesis 11, I don't see it. It's a very familiar story. Well, if you go to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, you will see it. The problem is that most of our English translations do not use the Dead Sea Scrolls in Deuteronomy 32, 8. ESV does. The NRSV does as well. NLT probably does. It's a little hard to tell from the translation, but I think it does. But let's go with ESV. It's the most literal. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. In other words, when the nations are formed, when these different national groups emerge and they get land. Okay, this is the result of Babel. When God confuses the languages, okay, he fragments and disperses people in judgment. At Babel, people are still not obeying what God wants them to do. After the flood, God tells Noah, okay, now we're going to repeat the Edenic idea again, be fruitful and multiply, and I want you to spread over the earth and all this stuff. We're going to try again to restore Eden, to restore what was lost. We used a flood to deal with the proliferation of depravity. We're going to try again. You go to Genesis 9:19. Let's just use the other translation for that. You get a very specific connection. These are the three sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. If you go again to the next chapter, Genesis 10, what do you get? The table of nations descended from Noah and his sons. Then Genesis 11 is the story of how these nations came to be in terms of their distribution. And that is what Deuteronomy 32 is referencing. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, other translations, here ESV has a nice little footnote. Compare Dead Sea Scroll Septuagint. The Masoretic text, that is the traditional Hebrew text, reads sons of Israel. Like the King James, sons of it. And I grew up on the King James as a new believer. So I literally never saw this. It was invisible to me. What you say, well, what's the point here? Well, verse 9, you need to get the full point. So God divides up the nations according to the number of the sons of God. So there's some kind of equivalent being drawn. There's some kind of relationship, analogical relationship between the nations and other members of the heavenly host that aren't God, but they're part of the heavenly host. They're part of, the entourage, so to speak. And the nations are somehow aligned. Let me use Deuteronomy 4 language. They are allotted, okay, to the members of the heavenly host, and the members of the heavenly host are allotted to them. These are the ones that the other nations worship. You, Israel, the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. You only worship Yahweh. The Lord, our God, is one. We worship only one. Okay? The other nations have other gods allotted to them. You do not worship them. They are under judgment. They are under punishment. Essentially what happens in Deuteronomy 32 is God divorces humanity. I'm done. It's our third try at this. We had Eden, and we had to do the flood. Now we're here, and you're doing the same thing. You're disobeying me. You don't want me to be your God. Fine. I'm going to punish you. I'm going to allot you to other gods, other sons of God. And they're going to be placeholders. They're going to, be your supervisors now. Now, God wants them ruled well. How do we know this? Because all humans are God's imagers. And God, right after he sentences them, right after God divorces himself from the rest of humanity. So God is childless in one sense after Babel. The Adam and Eve experiment is done. But God doesn't want it to be done. He's done with these people, at least for a long time. So, because what God does right after he does this is what's the next thing that happens in the biblical storyline? He says, now watch what I'm going to do. I'm divorcing you people, and I'm going to divide you up into these national entities, and I'm going to assign other supernatural beings, to your leadership, and you're going to worship them, or you wind up worshiping them. So I'm not going to relate to you one-on-one or anymore individually. I'm done. We're done here until I say otherwise. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm not giving up on the original idea. I'm going to go to Ur of the Chaldeans, because there's a guy and his wife there that are perfect for my next move. I'm going to call this Abram guy and his wife, who can't have children. She's perfect. Because when I enable her to have a child, there will be no doubt among those people and the rest of you that this nation exists to be the new Adam and Eve, and they exist only because of a supernatural act of God. So they're perfect. God calls Abram. We know the story. He makes a covenant with Abram. And what does he say in the covenant? Genesis 12:3. He promises Abraham a few things, and he says, now, I want you to know that it's through your offspring that someday someone from your offspring is going to be the thing or the person through which all of these other nations will be blessed. God has not forgotten about them. He has not put them on the shelf permanently. They are under judgment. Now, in the course of the Old Testament story, people from these nations can choose to come over and believe in the God of Israel. Rahab does. Naaman does. Apparently the widow of Zarephath did too. She was willing to put her life on the line for Yahweh's prophet. By the way, the widow of Zarephath and Naaman are Jesus in his first sermon at Nazareth. They are his two examples of faith. And he pits two pagans over against the Pharisees. And that made them happy. Okay. These two obscure pagans. I'll show you what real faith is. It ain't you guys. It's these two pagans over here. People could do this. But the reality is that they're enslaved. And God didn't intend for them to be directed away from him and enslaved. That's what Psalm 82 is about. God is angry with the way the situation has developed. They're created with free will just like we are. It's one of the attributes of God. And this all goes back to divine imaging and what that means. God is angry with them and says, because you have sown chaos among your nations, because of the injustice that you sow, among these people, I'm going to punish you. You're going to die like men. Now, it's an eschatological judgment. We know that from other passages in the prophets. We also know it from the New Testament, which we'll get to in a moment. But this is the picture. This is the third rebellion, the fragmentation of humanity. This is the reason why idolatry becomes rampant. It explains the rest of the Old Testament in a number of ways. If you want the details on, by the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, and again, if you're having trouble sleeping, okay, this is on the archive page, this article I published through Dallas Seminary's journal. So it's not a liberal journal, sorry. There it is, Dallas Seminary. But the Dead Sea Scrolls read, he divided them up according to the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. Right, here's the text, 4Q Deuteronomy Q, and in a transcription. So, you know, we have this situation where we have a death problem because of Genesis 3. Everything dies now. Humans are estranged from God, so that's one reason why the world's a mess. The Genesis 6 thing is really about the dispensing of divine knowledge or forbidden knowledge to help humans more efficiently destroy themselves. The Nephilim problem is taken care of by the time of David. That's a secondary concern, even though we tend to fixate on it. They were more concerned with the depravity that it created. And then the third problem is the nations are worshiping other gods. And they're slaves to those sons of God who somewhere along the line just either failed or they became corrupt or whatever, but it's not a good situation. It's something that God hates. That's why the world is a chaotic mess. We have three reasons in intertestamental Jewish thought. Now, if you believe this, you also believe that when the Messiah comes, he's supposed to fix all three, not just one. He's not here to fix Genesis 3 and leave the other two go. He is here to fix all of it. And there are lots of things in the Gospels and the Epistles that say, yeah, he does that. One other note here, again, about the sons of Israel reading. Again, you don't have to be a textual critic and know about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran. Israel didn't exist when Babel happened. So God isn't going to divide the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. There is no Israel. That comes later when God calls Abraham. Again, it's not permanent. It explains certain things in the Old Testament. You have Abram, which we just talked about. It's interesting that Israel is referred to, and every Israelite is referred to as a kingdom of priests. Yeah, Israel had a priesthood, Leviticus, we all know that. I know Leviticus is everyone's favorite book, I know. We know this, they had a priesthood, but they, as an entity, as a nation, they were supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a separate nation unto God. Why? God just likes when people behave oddly. No, they're supposed to be a mediator. They're supposed to be an example of what life is supposed to be like, what life could have been like in Eden, where we have the true God, his presence with us. I mean, Israel had no police force. Did you realize that in the Old Testament? There is no police force like to enforce all these laws, okay? You're supposed to be living in the most optimal way in relationship with the true God to attract people in the nations where they are enslaved and living in chaos, where there is all this wickedness, the bloodshed, the immorality, the terror. You're supposed to be an example of what they should want. But Israel fails.